For more than 20 years, vanilla World of Warcraft had one rule. If you want to play Paladin, you play Alliance. If you want to play Shaman, you play Horde. It's one of the oldest differences between the two factions. And even when Blizzard did Season of Discovery, a version of vanilla WoW specifically designed around expanding the original game, they kept the same rule. However, during Season of Discovery, Blizzard quietly started placing some very strange NPCs around Azeroth. NPCs that seemingly hinted at something much bigger. A Tauren wielding abilities that he shouldn't have, an undead character with a connection to the light, and a dwarf discovering a connection to the elements. And if you looked closely, during a brief period of time on the Season of Discovery PTR, it looked like Blizzard was finally preparing to break one of vanilla WoW's oldest rules. But then the NPCs disappeared and nothing ever happened. So what exactly was Blizzard working on? And with Classic Plus being the next evolution of Classic WoW, did Blizzard already leave us a clue about one of its biggest changes? Now, to understand why any of this matters, you have to go all the way back to the original design of World of Warcraft, because vanilla wasn't designed to make the Horde and Alliance equal. The factions were supposed to feel different. Different cities, races, questing experiences, different stories, and most importantly for this video, different classes. That meant choosing a faction actually determined something as fundamental as which classes you could play. If your guild was Horde and you wanted Wind Fury Totem, ask your Shaman. If your guild was Alliance and you wanted Blessings and Paladin auras, have your Paladin start buffing. It created an imbalance though between the factions, but it also gave them a specific identity. And Blizzard eventually decided to move away from that design. When the Burning Crusade released, Blood Elves brought Paladins to the Horde, while Draenei brought Shamans to the Alliance. From that point forward, this old vanilla rule was basically gone. But when Classic returned in 2019, that rule was brought back. And when Season of Discovery launched in 2023, Blizzard suddenly had an opportunity to experiment with vanilla's rules again. Warlocks, rogues, shamans could tank, and even mages could heal. Classes received abilities they never had in original vanilla. Entire dungeons and raids were redesigned, new quest lines appeared, and Blizzard essentially turned vanilla Azeroth into a giant experiment. But there was still one line they didn't cross. Alliance still couldn't create shamans, and Horde still couldn't create paladins, except there were signs that Blizzard may have at least thought about it, and the first breadcrumb was already sitting in Season of Discovery. Now, during Season of Discovery's initial release, players discovered a Tauren named Brave Stonetorch in Hillsbrad Foothills. At first glance, there's really nothing remarkable about him. He's a Tauren warrior, but if you actually look at the character, something stands out. Brave Stonetorch has an ability that a Tauren warrior shouldn't have: Devotion Aura, a paladin ability, and his dialogue makes this situation even stranger. Stonetorch talks about searching for a brilliant white stone that supposedly fell from the sky. He refers to it as a tear of Anche. And if you're familiar with Tauren Paladins in modern World of Warcraft, that name should immediately stand out, because Anche is the sun god, portrayed as one of the eyes of the Earth Mother, and eventually the Tauren's connection to Anche would become the foundation for the Sunwalkers, the Tauren Paladins introduced later in World of Warcraft. But Brave Stonetorch was standing in Season of Discovery, a version of vanilla WoW, using Devotion Aura, talking about Anche, and seemingly exploring the beginnings of an idea that shouldn't exist yet: a Tauren connected to Paladin abilities. Now, on its own, this NPC could easily be dismissed as Blizzard playing around with future Tauren lore, a small reference to something we know eventually happens in World of Warcraft, except Blizzard wasn't done with the idea, because later in Season of Discovery, they created an entirely new storyline around another character, and this one took the idea of a Horde Paladin much further. His name is Gregory, or I should say, Gregory the Truthbearer. And Gregory's story is actually much more complicated than simply calling him a Death Knight. Gregory was once a paladin. He was once a member of the Knights of the Silver Hand, but was killed by Arthas. He was raised into undeath, became a Death Knight, and eventually became part of an entirely new storyline created specifically for Season of Discovery. And then, during the PTR of Phase 8 of Season of Discovery, players found Gregory again, except this time he wasn't standing in some endgame zone. He appeared in Death Knell, the Forsaken starting area, as an actual undead NPC. Think about what Blizzard is setting up here. A Death Knight who you could also claim is undead, also a former paladin, rediscovering his humanity instead of serving the Lich King, searching for others who have fallen, who still have a connection to the light. And suddenly, the speculation exploded, because if Blizzard ever wanted to create a vanilla-style explanation for Undead Paladins, they had just created a character who could potentially do it. But here's where this stops being a story about Horde Paladins, because at the exact same time Gregory appeared in the Forsaken starting zone, Blizzard added another strange NPC into Azeroth, and this time, the breadcrumb was pointing towards shamans. So if you've ever played a dwarf or a gnome in vanilla WoW, you've probably been through Coldridge Valley more times than you can remember. Anvilmar, boars, and trogs. It's one of the most recognizable starting areas in the game, covered in snow. But during testing for Phase 8 of Season of Discovery, Blizzard added someone who also wasn't supposed to be there. His name was Teo Hammerstorm, and if you've only played vanilla WoW, that name probably means absolutely nothing for you, because Teo wasn't originally in vanilla. He was added years later, and in modern versions of World of Warcraft, Teo Hammerstorm has a very specific job. He's a shaman trainer, a dwarf shaman trainer, which makes perfect sense in modern World of Warcraft, but in vanilla, dwarfs can't be shamans, and the Season of Discovery version of Teo wasn't simply copied directly from the modern game. Blizzard actually gave him dialogue specifically for Sod. When players spoke to him, Teo complained about the room feeling unusually staticky, and then he snapped his fingers and a spark of electricity appeared. Teo himself appeared surprised by it. On its own, this could easily be dismissed as an Easter egg, a little reference to the future. Players who know what Teo eventually becomes would understand the joke as he's beginning to discover his connection to the elements, except now we have a pattern. On the Horde side, a Tauren using a paladin ability and investigating Anche, then an undead former paladin appears in Death Knell saying he hopes others find their way back to the light, and now on the Alliance side, a future dwarf shaman trainer suddenly appears in Coldridge Valley. So now Blizzard had seemingly teased both sides of Vanilla's faction exclusive classes, Horde Paladins, Alliance Shamans, and with both Gregory and Teo appearing on the Phase 8 PTR, it looked like Blizzard might finally be preparing to do something with it, except when Phase 8 actually went live, it didn't happen. Teo Hammerstorm disappeared, Gregory's undead appearance disappeared, and Brave Stonetorch, he's still standing in Hillsbrad Foothills with Devotion Aura. So what exactly was Blizzard experimenting with? Now, none of this confirms that Blizzard was going to add Alliance Shamans or Horde Paladins to Season of Discovery. That's important. There was never an announcement, there was never a character creation option, and Blizzard never came out and said, yes, this is what we're going to do. But look at what is actually happening. A Tauren warrior using Devotion Aura and talking about the Sun God, a former Paladin who originally appears on the PTR as an undead Paladin, and then a future dwarf shaman trainer, 3 different characters, 3 different pieces of the world, all circling around the same exact question. What happens if Vanilla's faction exclusive classes aren't exclusive anymore? And then during live servers, nothing happened. No Horde Paladin option appeared, no Alliance Shaman option appeared, Season of Discovery continued into Phase 8, and the original faction restrictions remained, which leaves us with a question that I find way more interesting than whether Blizzard planned to put these faction changes into Sod. Why was Blizzard playing with this idea in the first place? Because when we look back at Season of Discovery, I think it's important to remember what Blizzard was actually doing with it. Sod was an experiment. Blizzard was taking vanilla World of Warcraft and asking questions. What if Black Phantom's Deeps was a raid? What if Nomergan was a raid? What if Karazhan Crypts became playable content? What if classes could perform roles they were never originally designed to perform? What if unfinished pieces of vanilla could actually be completed? Some experiments worked, some didn't. Some ideas made it all the way into the game and others were left out. And that's what makes these NPCs much more interesting now than they were when players originally discovered them, because Season of Discovery isn't the future of Classic anymore. We're waiting to find out what comes after it. When Blizzard creates the next evolution of Classic World of Warcraft, which is something players have spent years calling Classic Plus, then Blizzard has to answer the exact same questions all over again. What parts of vanilla are sacred and what parts are allowed to change? Because giving both factions, paladins, and shamans sounds simple, but it's actually one of the biggest philosophical decisions Blizzard could make with Classic Plus. It can't just be about adding more content. Eventually, Blizzard has to decide, what exactly are we preserving? Do we preserve vanilla exactly as it was? Simply build new zones, raids, and quests around it? Or do we take the original game and continue developing it as if World of Warcraft had gone in a completely different direction? Because those two ideas lead to a very different version of Classic Plus. And Paladins and Shamans are probably one of the best examples of that. Giving the Horde Paladins and the Alliance Shamans would make balancing the factions significantly easier. It would open completely new race and class combinations, and it would also create entirely new vanilla style class quest lines. But another thing to note is that Blizzard also wouldn't have to copy the Burning Crusade. They could have actually used the breadcrumbs they already created. Maybe Tauren developed the beginnings of the Sunwalker traditions earlier than they originally did, or maybe Gregory begins teaching the Forsaken that undeath doesn't necessarily mean abandoning the light. And on the Alliance, maybe dwarves rediscover shamanism through characters like Teo Hammerstorm. Those could become actual Classic Plus stories. Stories that develop naturally inside the vanilla world. But there's another side to this, because the imbalance is part of vanilla. Paladins being Alliance and Shamans being Horde is one of the things that make the factions feel fundamentally different. And when it comes to Classic Plus, if it potentially changes something like that, it moves slightly further away from the game it's supposed to be continuing. That's the balancing act Blizzard is eventually going to have to deal with. How much can you change vanilla before it stops feeling like vanilla? And that's why I wanted to talk about these NPCs, because maybe Brave Stonetorch was simply Blizzard playing around with the future Tauren lore. Maybe Gregory appearing in Death Knell was connected to something completely different. Maybe Teo Hammerstorm was nothing more than an Easter egg. And maybe Blizzard never seriously planned to give the Horde Paladins or the Alliance Shamans at all. However, we do know these ideas existed. Maybe these were breadcrumbs for something Blizzard ultimately abandoned, or maybe Season of Discovery was exactly what its name suggested, a place to discover which ideas could work. Because if Classic Plus really is about taking vanilla World of Warcraft somewhere it never went before, Blizzard doesn't have to invent every idea from scratch. Some of them might already be sitting inside the game, unfinished, abandoned, removed, waiting for someone to notice them. And maybe one of the biggest changes Classic Plus could make was already being tested right in front of us. So let me know what you think. Should Classic Plus finally give the Horde Paladins and Alliance Shamans? And if it does, which races should actually get them? Tauren Paladins, Undead Paladins, Dwarf Shamans, Night Elf Shamans? Or should Blizzard leave one of Vanilla WoW's oldest faction differences completely alone? Let me know down in the comments below. Also, a big shout out to Kako Gaming for letting me use some of his footage that I used in this video. With that said, be sure to like and subscribe for more World of Warcraft content. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Oh man, this is insane. There's so fucking many of them. Holy shit, dude. Oh, here they go! Dude, they came out like so fucking fast. Made a big mistake being first in line. Yeah.